You didn't realize how long you'd been holding your breath until the moment you finally let go. There wasn't a loud goodbye, no final argument, no grand explosion, just a quiet, irreversible decision that came from somewhere deeper than anger, a place of exhaustion, of clarity, of self-respect. And when it happened, you didn't feel victorious. You felt empty. For a while, that emptiness scared you. Because toxic people don't just drain your energy, they fill your world with noise. They give you something to react to, someone to tiptoe around, a chaos to navigate each day. When that chaos is gone, it feels like silence. And that silence, at first it's deafening. You might even start to miss the noise, not because it was good, but because it was familiar. But here's the truth, you weren't missing them. You were missing the part of yourself you forgot existed. You see, when you've been emotionally entangled with someone toxic, you adapt in ways you don't notice. You laugh smaller, you apologize more, you weigh your words carefully, not out of respect, but out of fear. You shrink your dreams so theirs won't feel threatened. And piece by piece, the real you starts fading into the background. That's what makes letting go so difficult. Not because you're losing love, but because you're stepping into unknown territory without the identity that chaos gave you. But something powerful happens when you stay in that silence long enough. Something ancient, something stoic. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Look well into yourself. There is a source of strength which will always spring up if you will always look there." And that's what this moment becomes. The beginning of your return, the return of your voice, the return of your energy, the return of your clarity. Not all at once, not in some dramatic transformation, but slowly, steadily, like sunlight warming your skin after a long winter. Because when you stop chasing after people who diminish your worth, you stop running from yourself. This is where everything begins to shift. You don't need closure from them. You don't need their apology. You need only one thing, the decision to no longer abandon yourself in order to keep someone else comfortable. And if you're here right now, it means something inside you has already changed. Even if you don't feel strong yet, you've done something most people never find the courage to do. You chose silence over survival, peace over chaos. You chose you. Let that sink in. You chose you. That was the first day of your rebirth. And what comes next might just change everything. When you were still in it, the confusion, the subtle emotional warfare, you didn't even realize how loud the noise had become. Every day was a performance. You edited yourself, softened your truths, hesitated before speaking. Not because you were unsure of what you believed, but because you were walking on a minefield of invisible reactions. One wrong word could trigger guilt, silence, sarcasm, or that look. That look that made you question everything, your tone, your timing, your worth. Over time, you stopped asking, "What do I want to say?" and started asking, "What will they be okay hearing?" That's how your voice disappeared. And the worst part, you didn't even notice it happening. It wasn't a sudden silence, it was gradual. It was death by 1,000 second guesses. But when you finally walked away, when the tedious influence was removed, something unexpected emerged. Stillness. At first, it was unnerving. You'd grown so used to scanning for danger, decoding moods, and managing emotional temperature that the absence of drama felt wrong. Your nervous system, wired for survival, didn't know what to do with peace. But as the days passed, the static started to fade. You found yourself no longer rehearsing conversations in your head, no longer explaining yourself to an invisible audience. You began waking up without dread, falling asleep without overthinking. And in that sacred stillness, your voice returned. Not the voice shaped by fear or guilt, not the one tailored to please or pacify, but the real one, your internal compass. The one that had always been there, quietly waiting beneath the noise. That's when clarity began to rise. Not just mental clarity, but emotional clarity. The kind that reminds you, I don't need to ask for permission to exist. The kind that says, my truth matters, even if it makes others uncomfortable. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, peace comes when you no longer invite chaos. And you finally close the door. Let me tell you a story. There was a man named James. For years, he maintained a friendship that felt off. It wasn't abusive, not on the surface, but every success James shared was met with a passive-aggressive joke. Every idea subtly dismissed, every moment of vulnerability used later as a weapon. And yet, James stayed. Why? Because he thought being a good friend meant enduring discomfort. He confused loyalty with self-abandonment. But eventually, life created distance, a falling out. No dramatic fight, just silence. And in that silence, James noticed something. His anxiety began to fade. His thoughts no longer revolved around how someone else might react. He felt lighter. And more than that, he heard his voice again. Unfiltered, honest, strong. That's when he realized the friendship hadn't just been draining, it had been defining who he was allowed to be. Maybe that's where you are right now. Or maybe you're still holding your breath, afraid that if you speak too loudly, you'll shake the fragile peace you've been trying to protect. But ask yourself this, whose peace is it? Theirs or yours? The moment you choose to let the silence stay, not as emptiness, but as sacred ground, is the moment you begin to reclaim your mental space. That space is yours, it always was. And the voice returning? That's not just healing, that's freedom. If this speaks to where you are right now, you're not alone. The path of clarity, emotional freedom, and self-respect is rarely loud, but it's deeply powerful. At True Stoic Way, we create videos exactly for people like you, those who are ready to stop surviving and start living with intention. If you're rebuilding your voice, your peace, and your purpose, subscribe and walk this path with us, because your voice is back, and the world needs to hear it. You thought you were just tired, just stressed, just going through a rough patch. But the truth is, you were emotionally exhausted. Not from life itself, but from carrying emotions that were never yours to begin with. Every sigh, every heaviness in your chest, every time you snapped over something small, they weren't random. They were signals, warnings. Your nervous system was trying to tell you that you were absorbing far more than you were built to carry, because being close to someone toxic isn't just about enduring arguments or defending yourself. It's about carrying the weight of someone else's emotional instability, day after day, without realizing it. Their anxiety became your job to calm. Their bitterness became your burden to soften. Their guilt became your default setting, even when you did nothing wrong. You found yourself managing their moods like walking a tightrope. One wrong step, and everything fell apart. So you stayed balanced, stayed small, stayed quiet, not out of love, but out of emotional survival. Over time, you couldn't tell the difference between your sadness and the sadness they dumped on you. You couldn't tell if the tension you felt was because of your own life, or just the residue of being too close to someone who feeds on chaos. That's how emotional fatigue sneaks in. But when you finally walk away, when you remove the source, something strange happens. At first, the exhaustion lingers. You still flinch internally at silence. You still expect to be pulled back into their storms. But slowly a shift begins. You start waking up with more energy. You don't dread your phone vibrating. You don't feel the tightness in your shoulders every time someone says, "We need to talk." That's your emotional energy returning. Let me tell you about Brian. He was always the steady one, the fixer, the friend everyone leaned on, especially one friend in particular, someone constantly in crisis. Every day brought new drama, a betrayal, a meltdown, a reason the world was against him. And Brian, he listened, he advised, he stayed present. He was the strong one. But over time, Brian began to change. He couldn't sleep deeply. He'd wake up tense. He was mentally foggy, snapping at his team during work. He thought something was wrong with him. Maybe burnout, maybe age. But when he stopped answering that one friend's endless messages, something shifted. He began sleeping through the night. He had energy to cook again. His mind was sharper. His patience returned. That's when he realized it wasn't just that friend's case. It was how much of it Brian had made his responsibility. And you? Maybe you've done the same. Maybe you're the stable one, the empathetic one, the problem solver. But let me ask you, at what Epictetus said it simply, "He who guards his peace guards his power." Your emotional energy is power. It fuels your creativity, your clarity, your capacity to love, and most importantly, your ability to show up fully for your own life. When you spend it managing someone else's constant dysfunction, you rob your future of strength. So how do you take it back? You start by noticing the drain. Pay attention to how you feel after every interaction, lighter or heavier, empowered or diminished. Then protect your emotional space like it's sacred, because it is. And finally, stop feeling guilty for walking away from what was never yours to carry in the first place. You weren't created to absorb someone else's chaos. You were meant to protect your peace and reclaim your power. There are wounds that scream, and there are wounds that whisper. And often, it's the quiet ones that cut the deepest. You didn't wake up one day and decide to tolerate emotional manipulation. It happened slowly, through 1,000 micro decisions. You brushed off that sarcastic remark. You excused the guilt trip. You justified the backhanded compliment. Because it wasn't that bad, right? They weren't cruel, just concerned. They weren't dismissive, just joking. They weren't controlling, just caring. That's how manipulation hides. Behind soft tones, sweet smiles, and phrases that sound supportive, but sting underneath. And you learned to live with it. At first, it felt uncomfortable, but over time, you began to train yourself to accept it. Not because you lacked strength, but because you thought enduring pain was the price of keeping the peace. That's what no one tells you. Your tolerance didn't mean you were weak. It meant you were surviving. You adapted. You adjusted your reactions. You tiptoed around triggers. You made yourself smaller. Not because you liked it, but because it kept things from exploding. But here's the problem. The more you normalize chaos, the more it becomes your reality. You stop noticing the energy it took to prepare for their moods. You forgot how free it feels to speak without second-guessing. You lost touch with how heavy their presence had become. Because the weight had been there for so long, you learned to walk with it. And when you finally get some distance, real distance, you see it for what it was. All the concern that was actually control, all the caring that was really guilt-tripping, all the loyalty that came with unspoken debts. Let me be honest with you. You tolerated far more than you should have, for far longer than you needed to. But that doesn't make you foolish. It makes you human. Let me share a story. There was a woman, and let's call her Claire. For years, she stayed in a friendship that felt off. Her friend always had a subtle way of twisting the knife, laughing at her goals, guilting her for spending time with other people, always playing the victim when confronted. But Claire stayed. She told herself that no one's perfect, that long friendships have ups and downs, that maybe she was the problem. Until life stepped in, the friendship slowly faded. No big fight, just space, and that space, it spoke volumes. Claire didn't feel this relief at first. She felt guilt, then confusion, then something she hadn't felt in years, stillness. That's when she realized she had tolerated the emotional abuse in disguise, all in the name of keeping things calm. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "What you allow is what will continue." You didn't cause the pain, but you allowed it to linger. Now you know better, so you raise your standards. You stop mistaking manipulation for love. You stop accepting discomfort just because it's familiar. You stop confusing survival with connection. And most of all, you stop apologizing for finally choosing yourself. Because peace isn't what happens around you. Peace is what happens when you stop allowing what breaks you. They always come back. Maybe not right away, maybe not with flowers or apologies, but eventually, after you've rebuilt a little peace, after your eyes stop looking for them in every room, they reach out. A message, a voice note, a nostalgic memory, something small enough to seem harmless, but calculated enough to reopen the door. And if you're not ready, it might feel like hope. But let's be honest, they're not coming back because they love you. They're not here for reconciliation. They're here for restoration, not of the connection, but of the control. Because when someone toxic loses access to you, they don't mourn the relationship. They mourn the power they had in it. They missed the version of you that bent, that softened, that tolerated their storms. You see, you were convenient. You made their chaos feel valid. You excused what others would have called abuse. You filled in every emotional gap they refused to deal with. And now that you're gone, they're not facing loss. They're facing accountability. That's why they circle back, not with changed hearts, but with familiar tactics. They'll say they've been thinking about the good times. They'll remind you of inside jokes, favorite places, shared songs. They'll mention how you just get them, how things weren't perfect, but they were real. Don't fall for it. Let me tell you about Daniel. He was in a relationship that slowly poisoned his spirit, not with screaming or slamming doors, but with subtle digs, endless blame, and emotional gymnastics that made everything his fault. It took him years to walk away, but when he did, the silence that followed was peaceful. Heavy at first, but real. He began sleeping, breathing, thinking. Then 3 months later, she reached out. No apology, no reflection, just a message. I miss what we had. She brought up their first trip together, the song they danced to. She even said, I haven't laughed the same since you left. And for a moment, just a second, Daniel softened. He remembered the version of her that smiled, held his hand, told him he was special. But then he remembered the version of himself during those years. Anxious, confused, always second-guessing his worth. And that clarity saved him. Because what she missed wasn't him. It was his access. It was his availability. It was the control. Epictetus said, the wise do not return to chains they've broken. You walked away for a reason. And if you forget that reason, nostalgia will rewrite your pain into poetry. So when they return, don't listen to their words. Watch their patterns. Are they different or just delayed? And if you're tempted to respond, ask yourself one thing. Are you missing them or just missing who you were trying to be in their presence? Because when peace starts to settle, manipulation starts to panic. And the strongest thing you can do is not answer the knock. There's a silence that soothes, and there's a silence that stings. When you finally cut ties with someone who drained you for so long, you expect relief, and in many ways you get it. The drama stops. The unpredictability fades. But then something else sets in. The ache. Not pain, not regret, just space, a strange, unfamiliar emptiness. Like a chair that's always been filled suddenly sitting vacant. Like a quiet apartment where no footsteps echo. Like a part of your daily noise suddenly missing. That's the paradox of healing. Before peace feels powerful, it feels lonely. You're not craving their toxicity. You're just used to having someone to react to. Even chaos can feel like company when you've lived with it long enough. But here's what no one tells you. Loneliness and drainedness are not the same. One makes you question, the other makes you disappear. When you were with them, you weren't alone, but you weren't truly present either. You were a version of yourself twisted by tension, dulled by compromise, hollowed out by emotional labor you never signed up for. Now, standing in your own silence, you start to feel all the feelings you had buried. You might mistake that flood of emotion for a mistake. It's not. It's your body remembering what it means to belong to you again. Let me tell you about Rachel. She'd been in a friendship for over a decade, the kind that was built on shared history, inside jokes, and loyalty. But beneath that surface was a constant drip of criticism, comparison, and emotional dismissal. Her best friend often made her feel invisible, but leaving felt unthinkable. Until one day Rachel stopped reaching out. No grand speech, just silence. At first it hurt. The void was real. She missed the texts, the routine, the sense of connection, even though it often came with subtle wounds. But slowly she noticed something. She had more energy. She stopped questioning her worth. Her smile came easier. Her creativity returned. And her inner world, once filled with emotional noise, became a place she actually wanted to live in again. Seneca once wrote, "Solitude is not the absence of love, but the presence of self-respect." That's what you're learning. Being alone doesn't mean you're unloved. It means you're done begging for love that costs you your dignity. And when you give yourself enough time in that sacred quiet, peace begins to take root. Not the fragile kind that depends on someone else's behavior, but the unshakable kind that rises from within. You begin to understand. You didn't lose something vital when they left. You made space for something better to grow. If you're in that quiet space right now, where it feels a little lonely, a little uncertain, know this, you're exactly where the shift begins. At True Stoic Way, we walk with you through the silence, through the discomfort, and into the strength waiting on the other side. Subscribe and stay close, not just for answers, but for reminders that you're not alone, that peace is coming, and that the ache you feel today is proof you're healing. When you finally choose yourself, fully, quietly, unapologetically, something strange begins to happen. The wrong people start to drift away, and the right ones begin to appear. It's not magic, it's alignment. Because when your self-worth rises, so does the frequency you send into the world. You stop chasing approval. You stop tolerating one-sided connections. You stop explaining your boundaries like there's something to be negotiated. Instead, you move differently, slower, stronger, clearer. And that shift, it changes everything. You no longer attract people who feed on your uncertainty. You begin drawing in those who are whole on their own, people who don't want to fix you or drain you, but walk beside you. People who respect pauses in conversation. People who hear your no and don't take it personally. People who offer peace, not performance. Because the truth is this, you teach the world how to treat you by how you treat yourself. Let me tell you about Josh. For years, he surrounded himself with people who wore the mask of friendship, but never offered real support. They joked at his expense, dismissed his ideas, and only called when they needed something. He stayed, not because it felt right, but because it felt familiar. But after walking away from one particularly toxic friend, something inside Josh shifted. He stopped responding out of guilt. He stopped chasing connection through compromise. And over time, he noticed a quiet transformation. New people entered his life, co-workers who respected his time, friends who listened as much as they spoke, even a romantic relationship that felt steady, not stormy. And for the first time in years, Josh felt safe to be himself. That's what happens when you stop settling. You don't need to advertise your healing. You don't need to prove your growth. The right people will recognize your silence as strength. So don't rush it. Don't fill the new space with noise just because the old noise is gone. Let the peace echo for a while. That echo is calling in the ones who were always meant to meet the real you. There's a difference between surviving and truly living. You didn't notice when it began. How you went from waking up with a sense of purpose to waking up just trying to make it through the day. How your calendar was full, but your heart felt empty. How you stopped dreaming, not because you didn't care anymore, but because it felt safer not to. That's what life under the weight of a toxic presence does. It shrinks you. Your days become about management, not momentum. You monitor moods. You avoid landmines. You pour your energy into keeping the peace. And in the process, you lose the will to build anything for yourself. But when that weight lifts, truly lifts, something inside you stirs. At first, it's subtle. You wake up one morning and realize your chest doesn't feel tight. You make coffee and realize you're not rushing through your thoughts. You go for a walk, not because it's productive, but because it feels good. And then something wild happens. You want more. Not more distractions, not more validation, more meaning, more movement, more you. Because when the environment stops poisoning your roots, your growth becomes inevitable. Epictetus said, "You cannot grow in poisoned soil." He was right. Let me tell you about Emily. She had been in a long-term relationship that never looked toxic on the surface. There were no fights in public, no cruel words in text. But behind closed doors, there were small, consistent cracks. Criticism disguised as feedback. Sarcasm dressed as jokes. Support that always came with strings. Over time, Emily stopped taking creative risks. She abandoned her love of photography. She declined new projects at work. She shrank slowly and silently because growing had become dangerous. But when the relationship finally ended, she didn't bounce back immediately. In fact, she felt blank. Until one day she picked up her old camera, not for work, not for anyone, just to capture the way sunlight hit her kitchen window. And in that moment, something returned, not just joy, but curiosity. She started saying yes to new ideas again. She rebuilt her portfolio. She signed up for a weekend class. And eventually she transitioned into a career that aligned with her real passion, not someone else's preferences. Emily didn't just recover. She reclaimed. She rebuilt. She remembered. And you can too. Growth doesn't always look like a leap. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it starts with breathing deeper, smiling more, saying no without guilt, saying yes without fear. But make no mistake, it is growth. And once you feel it, you'll never want to go back. There's a transformation that doesn't make a sound. It doesn't happen with a slammed door, a dramatic speech, or a final message left unread. It happens in stillness. In that exact moment when you decide, not out of anger, not out of pride, but out of truth, that they no longer have access to you. Not just to your time, not just to your presence, but to your emotional core. The place they used to tap into so effortlessly, and they feel it. Not because you told them, but because their games no longer work. Their silence no longer controls you. Their presence no longer excites or terrifies. They knock, and there's no one on the other side to answer. You didn't get colder. You didn't turn bitter. You got clear. Clear on who you are, clear on what you deserve, clear on what you'll no longer carry. Your silence has become a boundary louder than words. Not the kind of silence that waits to be broken, but the kind that holds. Steady, sovereign, final. And that's what truly disturbs those who once relied on your emotional reactions to feel powerful. When your nervous system no longer flinches, when your voice no longer explains, when your energy no longer bends, they realize they no longer have a way in. You're no longer inside the game. You've stepped out of the arena, and that decision is liberation. This is what the Stoics meant when they said, "Be like a rock that the waves keep crashing against, unmoved by the storm." You're not ignoring them to punish them. You're not avoiding them to prove a point. You've simply risen to a place where their chaos can no longer reach. And perhaps most importantly, you no longer need to be understood by them. You no longer seek closure, apology, or recognition. You've become the kind of person whose peace is self-sourced, whose value is self-defined, and whose boundaries are not up for debate. They lost access, not because you slammed the door, but because you quietly stopped opening it. And in doing so, you stepped into a rare kind of freedom. Not the freedom that shouts, but the freedom that no longer needs to explain itself. You didn't just walk away, you broke a cycle, a quiet, suffocating cycle that once defined your days and shaped your sense of self. You stopped responding to emotional traps. You stopped molding yourself into someone easier to control. You stopped measuring your worth through someone else's approval. And in doing so, you began the long, sacred work of coming home to yourself. It didn't happen in a single moment. It was a process. First came the pain of release, the ache of letting go of something that once felt like identity. Then came the silence, a stillness so vast it scared you. And finally, slowly came the return of your voice, your energy, your direction, your peace. You realize that peace isn't passive, it's chosen, protected, built, breath by breath. This is the Stoic way. Not to fight chaos with more case, but to rise above it with discipline, with dignity, with detachment. Not as a performance, but as a principle. You learned that self-respect is louder than any argument. That stillness is more powerful than any revenge. And that walking away isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Because true strength isn't proven in how loud you speak. It's shown in what you refuse to respond to. You didn't retaliate. You didn't attack. You didn't try to hurt them the way they hurt you. You just lived better. And that's the kind of power no one can steal. A life rebuilt on your own terms, defined not by escape from them, but elevation beyond them. You stopped surviving their storms and started creating your own calm. You stopped apologizing for taking up space and started standing in it, fully, fiercely, freely. This is your silent rebirth, not a reinvention, but a remembrance of who you were before the noise and who you are now without it. If you're still in the early stages, if the silence feels more like sorrow than strength, come back to this video whenever you need to. Let it remind you that healing isn't linear, but it is inevitable, as long as you don't look back at the people who once made you forget your worth. And if this message resonates with where you are in your journey, you are not alone. At True Stoic Way, we walk this path together, with philosophy, with perspective, and with quiet fire. Subscribe to join us, not because you're broken, but because you're finally rebuilding from truth. Let the world keep guessing. You no longer need to prove anything. Because here's the final truth. You didn't just let go of them, you finally held on to yourself.